Okay, hi everybody. Okay, it looks like we're starting to get our first few people logging on. This is going to be another AMA live stream, so if you have any questions, please go ahead, type them into us, message them over, and I will do my best to get to them. We do have some pre-submitted questions that I'm going to try to touch on first, so if I don't get to your question, you can either follow up with an email to info@sweetmarias.com and we can answer specific questions there. You can also send your questions to byron@sweetmarias.com, and we'll try to touch on that on our next live stream, which should be week after next. We're going to try to be holding these live events a little bit more often, maybe do some stuff that's a little bit more focused, or try to do a few demos, that kind of a thing, depending on our capabilities while we're unable to host any events in person, unfortunately, just for the safety of everyone. For anyone who is here, just a little bit about me. My name is Ryan. I've been at Sweet Maria's almost 3 years now. I've been working in specialty coffee since 2014. First as a barista and cafe manager, and then moving over to Sweet Maria's. I do a lot of merchandise stuff. I do some customer service. I write some articles. It's kind of all over the place, so I wear a lot of hats. Okay, so folks are still kind of starting to log on. I'm going to go ahead and start running through some of the questions that were submitted over the last week online. Again, for anyone who's just joining, you can submit questions via the live stream right here. Just pin a comment up and I'll take a look at it. If we don't get to you, send it to us in an email to either info@sweetmarias.com for a written response, or you can send it to byron@sweetmarias.com and we'll try to touch on it on our next live stream. Okay. So our first question comes from Michael in Missouri. He says that he really enjoys chocolatey coffees and he also loves chocolate-covered coffee beans. Do we have any recommendations for origins, types, or roasts to make a good chocolate-covered bean? Okay, so kind of talking about just chocolatey coffees, the good news is that pretty much any coffee from any origin we have is going to have some kind of chocolate note to it, some kind of chocolate component. There's kind of a pleasant bittersweetness that we associate with chocolate and that we also associate with coffee. They're kind of linked in our brain and in our palate, which is part of the reason why we pick up so many chocolate notes when we are tasting coffee. The darker you roast, the more chocolate you're going to tend to notice, because development tends to bring out more of the bitterness in the coffee, especially in the caramelization phase, which is going to happen after first crack. All of that said, there are definitely some origins that seem to have more chocolate as a core flavor of the coffee. Personally, when I think of chocolate-dominant coffees, I go to Central and South America. I know if you want kind of like a soft, sweeter milk chocolate note to it, something like that, a lot of times Peru's, Brazil's would be a really good choice. A lot of times they'll have kind of a nutty component going on. Peru, I often notice like a chocolate hazelnut thing, so it's very Nutella reminiscent. Moving on to Central America, Costa Rica's a lot of times have big, bold notes to them. Same thing with like Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala as well. Definitely you're going to want to read the cupping notes, kind of look at the flavor wheels and stuff that we include with our coffee reviews, because no origin is a monolith. you could end up with like a real fruit bomb, especially if you're looking at something like a Guatemala. But again, even something like Kenya, which is associated with a lot of kind of brightness and snappy acidity and those kinds of things, if you roast it a little bit darker, give it a little bit more development, you're going to bring out more of those chocolate notes just because they're going to be developing some of that bitterness. Again, chocolate is really similar to coffee in a lot of ways. If you look at like where it comes from with the bean that's been fermented and processed and roasted. The reason why I bring that up is just because chocolate, just the way that coffee can have all kinds of notes and all kinds of flavors, chocolate is the same way. You can have a really fruity chocolate, you can have something that's more bitter or dry, that kind of a thing. So even though like, the flavor wheels that we carry are a really good place to look, looking at something with a big score in cocoa, I'd also recommend reading the more in-depth cupping notes for a little bit more information about what kind of chocolate you're going to be getting. If it's going to be more of like a dry kind of cocoa powder or baking chocolate note versus kind of a sweeter milk chocolate or chocolate syrup, something like that. Another thing you can use if you're overwhelmed by our coffee list and you're looking for something that's a little bit more kind of chocolatey, that kind of a thing going on, we do have the flavor and profile filters. Those are going to be on the left-hand side of our green coffee list. We have one coffee in particular, or one profile in particular, chocolate bittersweets. That's going to narrow it down and just bring out coffees that have chocolate as a core flavor, as kind of a dominant flavor in the coffee. And from there, you can kind of go through, read some of the cupping notes and narrow it down a little bit further for something that you might want. As far as coffee for chocolate-covered coffee bean, obviously this is delicious. I really love it. I think doing this with a dry processed coffee might be kind of a fun option because you're going to get some of those kind of more fruity notes along with the chocolate. It could be kind of tasty, almost like a Java kind of thing going on. In general, I would say if you're going to be covering these in chocolate, I might roast it a little bit darker than I would otherwise for two reasons. One, you're going to have the sweetness from the chocolate, so it'll balance out some of the bitterness from the coffee. Part of it is also that beans lose density and get less hard the darker you roast. You're doing a city roast and you're covering it in chocolate, you'll obviously be able to chew it, but you might have to bite down a little bit harder. So might as well take it easy on your teeth and roast it a little bit darker. As far as the type of coffee bean I would recommend, it's hard for me to recommend buying like a super high quality bean, especially if you're going to be roasting it a little bit dark and then covering it in chocolate, because you're going to be losing a lot of the kind of origin characteristics that make that coffee special anyways. So I might opt for something that's a little bit more expensive, that maybe has a little bit more body, so it'll hold up well in a dark roast. Another thing is if you have some older coffee that you stuck in the drawer and forgot about or something like that, that might show a little bit age as a brewed coffee, repurposing that as a chocolate covered coffee bean could be a really fun, good thing. So I guess that's what I have to say about that. Okay. So our next question comes from William, and he has questions about people who are just roasting in their backyard in a cast iron skillet using their eyes and nose. He also is curious about how to add flavoring to your coffee beans, whether you should flavor the beans green or flavor them after they're roasted. He also says that he roasted some beans while cooking steaks on the barbecue, and that gave them a different taste. So it definitely does not surprise me that the coffee tastes differently when roasted next to steaks. Part of the reason why airflow can be so important in coffee roasting is because coffee can absorb some flavors during the roasting process. So for instance, one of the best entry-level coffee roasters is going to be the Nostalgia, which is an air popper designed for popping popcorn. But we don't recommend using it for both popcorn and coffee because your popcorn will start to taste like coffee and your coffee will start to taste like popcorn. Even smoke and the quality of smoke can make a difference in the end taste of your coffee. For example, I was roasting on the Quest a lot last week while I was working from home, and I noticed that I really needed to ramp up the airflow at certain points in the roast to make sure smoke was getting pulled out of the drum. Because when I didn't do that, my coffee came out tasting a little bit kind of like smoky and ashy, even though it wasn't roasted super dark. Some people really like that. Some people will do like use special types of wood and that kind of stuff for roasting because they want to bring out those profiles or those flavors. It's not for me personally. But again, like one of the fun things about roasting your own coffee is that you get to experiment and try different stuff. And if you want to try cooking your roasting your coffee next to like some different stuff and see how it changes the taste, I say go for it. Experimentation can never hurt, and I'm not here to yuck anyone's yum, which again kind of brings me to flavor oils and those kinds of things. A really common one is like hazelnut, or I know in Texas like butter pecan is a really popular flavor that you kind of add to your coffee on top of it. So the way that that is typically done is oils are added to the coffee beans after they've been roasted, so not before. After that, after they've been roasted, you would toss the beans in the oil, let it kind of like sit and soak for at least 30 minutes. I would say to be careful with these oils. I know they've come out with some newer ones over the years, but in the past, some have a chemical compound that can be really damaging to your lungs. So if you are using that, definitely look at the ingredients and the facts, look it up. Maybe use a face mask. I know we all have face masks these days, so that's a perfect chance to break it out. Some of these flavor oils first came around with like butter flavoring with instant popcorn. So there's actually a syndrome called popcorn lung because so many workers who were in these factories working with these oils without ventilation or protective equipment ended up getting really severe damage to their lungs, and some died. So definitely be careful. I'm not saying if you use flavor oils you're going to die, but it's something to be aware of. Another thing to be aware of if you want to add flavoring to your coffee beans, if you're looking at coffee that you buy like at the grocery store that's hazelnut flavored, that kind of a thing, a lot of times those flavors are actually being used to cover up low quality coffee that doesn't taste super great on its own, or kind of like agey coffee, that kind of stuff. Again, roasting your own coffee is about getting it the way you like, so if you really want those flavors, I say go with it. But I would recommend staying away from maybe a more expensive coffee, something like a geisha, just because if you're going to add flavor, you're blocking up a lot of the origin characteristics that are making that coffee more expensive or making that coffee more special. So it's just a waste of money to use like a really great coffee if you're going to add extra flavoring to it. As far as backyard roasting goes, or roasting in a cast iron skillet, that kind of stuff, I always recommend reviewing the tip sheet for stovetop roasting. We also have some really great videos on our YouTube channel where Tom roasts in a skillet. Personally, I've found that the trickiest part of stovetop roasting can be heat management, just because you want to preheat, otherwise it'll take you forever to get your coffee up time. But if you get it too hot, you can scorch the beans. Obviously, there are ways of kind of moving it around to try to prevent the scorching, but it's really hard to prevent that. Usually, preheating on stovetop or on a cast iron skillet, you're going to be aiming for around like 200 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a lot lower than a typical charge temp that you might see in like a drum roaster or something like that. And again, that's to kind of prevent some of the scorching. If you're going for a light roast, I'd say like taking a little bit more time to kind of ramp up the heat during that drying phase, which is before the Maillard reaction, so kind of just getting into yellowing. That can be a really good way of targeting a light roast because you're getting all the coffee pretty even and developed, so you won't end up with a super uneven roast, which can be a problem with stovetop roasting. Also, fast cooling is a great way of kind of locking in a lighter roast. Yeah, I hope that helps. And if you have more questions, obviously send us an email and we can give you more information. All right. So moving on to our next pre-submitted question. This one is coming to us from Ben, and his question has to do with Burundi coffees. He asks if these farmers are typically following organic practices, even though they don't necessarily have the money to become certified organic. It's a great question, Ben. Organic certification is something that we've always kind of tussled with because it's definitely a concern of ours, particularly for the health of the land, the health of the farmers, that kind of a thing. When it comes to like issues of getting pesticides on your cup or that kind of a thing, I don't think it's a huge issue because you're going through processing, which involves fermentation, removing the outside of the fruit. You're going to be roasting. There's a lot of kinds of different stages that coffee goes through that are going to remove any kind of leftover pesticides. You're way more likely to get pesticides from like a tomato that you get from the grocery store that isn't organic. You don't wash your produce. But it is a concern for the farmers. There are some regions we always say like Ethiopia and Yemen are really good examples of places where most of the techniques are rather traditional. They're usually smaller farms, especially with specialty coffee. So even if they can't afford specialty or organic certification, they're basically following organic practices. So with reference to Burundi in particular, first off, we have a ton of really great information specifically about Burundi and also Rwanda, which is its neighbor and has a lot of similar practices in our library. One article I definitely would highlight are Rwanda and Burundi fundamentals because there's a ton of really great information about coffee cultivation and processing in these two neighboring countries. As well as some videos explaining kind of the specific economics of coffee in Burundi, processing, farming, those kinds of things. Speaking of the library, I know it can be a little bit difficult to use the search function in the library or kind of locate some articles, and we are actively working on making that more easy to navigate, so thank you for bearing with us. If you're ever having trouble looking for a specific article, obviously you can always email us, or a strategy I'll use sometimes when I know an article exists and can't find it on our website is I'll just go to Google and type in Sweet Maria's and a keyword or the name of the article, and it usually pops right up. Hopefully we'll be able to get that search better integrated into the site itself. Anyways, back to Burundi. So coffee is actually a pretty recent crop in Burundi. It was introduced in the 1930s, and most of coffee cultivation in Burundi is comprised of smallholder farms. So those are farms with maybe 50 to 250 trees per farm. It's pretty small. Most of this coffee is delivered by the farmers to either a private wet mill for processing or to a cooperative for processing. Most of the coffee is going to be processed using a double fermentation that's similar to what you might see from like a Kenyan coffee. One of the great things about Burundi, and I know this doesn't have anything to do with organic certification, but I'm going to wrap around to that, is the high premiums we pay for quality coffee has a really huge impact on these farmers because it is mostly these kind of smallholder farmers with small farms and not a whole lot of trees. Those higher premiums that we pay can mean a higher initial payment. It can mean a second bonus payment. It can also mean reinvesting in things like more coffee trees. in sustainable agronomy training, and then also goats for organic process or composting. Most of the fertilizer used in Burundi is organic, from goats and that kind of things, because that's what they have access to. Like you said, it's not a country where these small farmers have a ton of money to kind of go out and buy a bunch of like pesticides or kind of inorganic fertilizers, that kind of a thing. There are a lot of California redworms as well. Fun fact, that are used for composting in coffee areas. Those were brought over into like Rwanda and Burundi in the like mid-90s to help with composting, because composting some coffee matter can be really difficult to kind of break down. Again, the goats also help with that. That kind of gets recircled back into a really effective compost to be used in the next year and hopefully continue to boost the crop. So short answer to your question is yes, most of these coffees are going to be organic by default, but you know, I don't want to say yes, all coffees from Burundi are organic. If there is a specific coffee you're ever interested in or want more information about, be it Burundi or anything else, definitely check the farm notes. We include a fair amount of information and try to include as much as we can just in the coffee reviews. You can also send us an email. Again, you can send that to info@sweetmarinas.com, and we can either give you more information that we have or check in with our coffee buyers and see if they have any extra detail about the specific farming practices for a given coffee. All right, Ben, I hope that answers your question. All right, so we're coming to the tail end of our pre-asked questions. We've got about 3 or 4 more to go, so definitely keep typing in any questions you've got if you have them. Jim has a question about telling the difference between a city or a city plus roast. And he is currently roasting in a beam war. He did provide us with some specific information about that, but I can go ahead and circle back with him because I want to kind of keep this to stuff that applies to everyone. So how to tell the difference between a city and city plus roast. It's a pretty subtle difference, so definitely don't feel bad if you're having a little bit of trouble distinguishing that. One thing I definitely recommend checking out is our library articles about using 5 senses to determine roast level, especially the visual guide. This gets really in depth about kind of like the minute differences between these different roast levels and where we kind of put them, although to a certain extent it's also just sensation when you taste it. I would say with city and city plus roasts, with both of those, if you're just looking at the bean, you're going to see a kind of like mottled surface texture with some dark, almost like etch marks or pock marks in there because it doesn't have the same kind of bean expansion that you'd see in a darker roast. One thing you might see in a city plus roast as opposed to a city roast, if you are holding 2 beans side by side, are slightly softer edges kind of around as the bean does start to expand a little bit more. It's a really subtle difference, and it's a short time between those 2 roast levels depending on what kind of roaster you're using and your heat settings and that kind of a thing. But it can be as little of a difference as like 15 seconds, 30 seconds to take you from a city roast to a city plus roast. One thing I will do if I'm trying to get a really light roast, like just like the lightest city roast I can get, is I will drop my beans before I've actually fully exited first crack. So I'll drop my beans and the beans will still be kind of cracking and going as they get into my cooling tray. You'll definitely, if you want to try this, definitely wait until the kind of tail end of first crack because you still want your coffee to be drinkable. You want to be able to grind it in your grinder without messing up your burrs. And definitely the first few times that I experimented with this, I might have gotten a little bit more rassiness and astringency because I didn't fully get through first crack. So it's definitely trial and error. But this is a good strategy if you want those like really snappy acidity or if you're trying to highlight floral notes and other stuff that might be overpowered at a darker roast level. One thing to keep an eye on, especially if you're roasting on the Beemore or another roaster that has an internal cooling system as opposed to an external cooling system, is trying to get your coffee cooled down as quickly as possible to lock in your desired roast level. So if coffee isn't cooled quickly, it can kind of coast or continue to roast and get a little bit darker even after the roast is complete. Especially in something like the Beemore where it's in this really kind of like hot, almost toaster oven environment. It's going to take a little while to cool down. Even with the cooling cycle going, it's pretty hot in there. Same thing would go for like the Gene Cafe and some of the other roasters that have an internal cooling system. External cooling is going to be best just because you're immediately getting into the cool air and you can cool it down a little bit faster. I know on the Beemore, some people have had really good luck opening the door of the roaster during the cooling cycle to kind of speed that up a little bit, get it a little bit cooler, a little bit faster. Beemore doesn't recommend bypassing the cooling cycle, but I have definitely done that and been able to lock in kind of my more desired roast level. Just by kind of stopping the roast, opening it up with oven mitts, definitely, because you can burn yourself really easily, carefully removing that roasting drum and then cooling it outside of the roaster itself. Another strategy is to actually go into the cooling cycle and end your roast a little bit before you actually want to stop your roast. That way, it'll coast right up to your desired roast level instead of going beyond it. If you are interested in building your own external cooling box, it's super easy. You can do it with a lot of stuff that you can just find around the house, and it's very cheap. You can build one using like a very inexpensive fan that you can get on Amazon or something like that, a cardboard box, and a colander or any kind of perforated tray. We have 2 videos that kind of walk you through this and how to do it. One is called A Cooler Way to Cool Your Beemore Roast, and the other video, both of these are on our YouTube channel, would be a Metal Muffin Fan Coffee Cooler. Okay. Our next question is from Rick, and Rick is asking about extending the roast. So Rick says, what I understand it to mean is lowering the temperature between first and second crack. He's tried this and he's not sure if he's doing it right. So extending the roast can apply to any stage of the roast. It doesn't necessarily have to be between first and second crack. We actually have a series of articles in our coffee library from a few years ago titled Stretching Out the Roast. I found these really helpful when I was first starting roasting and first trying to figure out how I wanted to build a profile and what things I should be looking for. There's 3 parts to the series, and each one focuses on extending a different part of the roast cycle, roast process. So part 1 addresses the stage between first and second crack, which is what Rick had mentioned. Part 2 looks at stretching out first crack itself, so making that crack longer or shorter. And part 3 looks at extending that drying stage, which again is when the coffee is kind of losing steam at the very beginning of the roast before the Maillard reaction has occurred. So kind of just getting to the yellowing stage of the roast. What stage of the roast you choose to extend will depend on the coffee you're roasting and on the final result you're looking for. You know, it is going to change depending on whether you want to emphasize the sweetness of the coffee, whether you really want to make acidity pop, or whether you really want to develop the body and get something full and round. Different coffees are going to shine best with different profiles. So my best advice about kind of experimenting with this is to roast several batches of the same coffee side by side, kind of stretching out one portion of the roast or condensing another and tasting them side by side and kind of thinking about what differences you notice, which ones taste better, and what qualities are kind of changing depending on what you alter in your roast. That I think is where the real learning and real mastery can come with roasting, because it's next to impossible to nail your first roast of any coffee, regardless of how many coffees you've roasted, or if it seems like it's going to be similar to another coffee you've roasted in the past. That can all kind of inform your first roast or inform your first profile, but every coffee is going to be a little bit different. So definitely experimenting, not being afraid to try a few different things out. The actual mechanics of how to extend your roast or how to extend a certain stage of your coffee is going to depend a lot on your roaster model. In general, the idea when you're extending a specific stage is to reduce the energy going into the roast chamber, the drum, or wherever your beans are. So you can do this either by altering the temperature settings and kind of bringing the temp down, or by manipulating airflow. Since roasters with electrical heating elements, which is what a lot of home roasters have, those can take a while to cool down just because the heating elements, even with all of the energy cut to them, are going to take a while to kind of naturally cool. I've found that playing around with airflow can be a more effective way of profiling on some of those roasters, kind of pulling more hot air out of the roast chamber or pumping more cool air in. Yeah, and again, if you do have a specific question about a specific roaster, or if a specific coffee is giving you trouble, or you're trying to get a specific thing out of a coffee that you can't quite seem to achieve, definitely send us an email. Again, that's info@sweetmarias.com. We're always happy to help you kind of puzzle something out and troubleshoot, and might be able to give you some ideas of how to improve that roast. Okay. So our next question, which comes from Pete, has to do with chaff. Why there's so much chaff, how to remove chaff, and whether or not chaff is going to have any kind of effect on your final product, on the final cup. I definitely feel your pain. Chaff is annoying. It flies everywhere. It gets there. It sticks to stuff. It makes your kitchen a mess. One thing I will say about chaff is that it really is flavorless. Even if you, if you have like a cup full of it, maybe it's going to make a slight difference in your cup, but it's really going to be pretty flavorless. It's not going to change a lot about the quality of your coffee. Sometimes it can just be like a perceptive thing where you see it and it doesn't seem great, and so you start to taste it, but it really is flavorless. As far as removing it goes, darker roasting is going to have less chaff. Decaf will have no chaff. With the darker roasts, it's because the chaff will kind of like burn away and turn to ash as it gets a little bit hotter, and will separate more from the coffee bean. As the bean expands and the coffee cracks open along that crease, it allows more of the chaff to get out. So Pete was actually kind enough to send us a picture of his roasted beans. Definitely on the lighter side, I would say probably around city plus roast. So you're going to still have a fair amount of residual chaff in that inner crack. It's kind of unavoidable. As far as removing it goes, there are a few different things that people do. A lot of it can just be shaking and agitating your beans to try to separate as much of that chaff away as possible. I know a lot of people will pass it back and forth between two colanders and then kind of suck away some of the leftover chaff with a shot vac or something like that. I've done that a little bit in the past, but the longer I've roasted, the more stuff I've kind of like done, the more I've just kind of given in, and I've stopped worrying about the chaff, and I've realized it really doesn't make a huge difference in my coffee experience, other than having a little bit more cleanup to do on my kitchen counter when the coffee comes out of my grinder. Pete specifically recommended or mentioned that he will separate the chaff from the grounds after he's ground his coffee. Kind of shaking your grounds to get the chaff to go up and then sucking it off. This is not something I would necessarily recommend, although if you're having good luck with it, if it's doing well for you, go on, do your thing. The reason is because as soon as coffee is ground, you're releasing a lot of the volatile compounds in the coffee, a lot of the aromatics, and the longer you take between grinding your coffee and brewing your coffee, the more of those compounds are going to kind of escape and go off into the air in your kitchen instead of making their way into your cup. Back when I was a barista working in cafes, if coffee was ground and something happened and we weren't able to brew it within, 3 minutes, we would usually dump those beans and start over again just because we knew it wasn't going to taste well. And that time limit goes down even further when you're talking about espresso. You definitely want to kind of pull that shot as soon as you've ground your coffee for espresso just to get the most out of it. So I would try to remove as much chaff as you can before you grind your coffee beans so that as soon as you've finished grinding, you can go ahead and brew and get the most out of your cup. It is interesting. I know a lot of people who have been really into coffee or have been buying commercially roasted coffee from their local shop or from a place like Pete's or Starbucks and then starts to home roast. They notice that there's a lot more chaff than they've ever noticed in the past, and there's some questions about why that's happening or where it comes from. A lot of it is because when you're talking about commercial roasters, they're using these super large, big drum roasters where the beans are getting tossed around a lot more than they might otherwise in a smaller batch with a smaller home roaster. And then they're also in the cooling tray being agitated and moved around a fair amount. So that can kind of help separate some of the chaff that's still sticking to the beans and the lighter end of the roast from the beans so it doesn't end up in your bag. Overall, I would say chaff shouldn't be a big concern. If you're really annoyed by it, really worried about it, roasting outside or in a basement or somewhere like that is a good way to kind of keep the chaff away from infecting your whole house. Sometimes using like a wet paper towel and laying that around your roaster, especially if you're using like a popper or something that's a little bit less contained or doesn't have chaff collection, the chaff will cling to the damp paper towels, so it makes for a little bit more of an easy cleanup at the end of it. I like putting my chaff in like my potted plants and my compost and that kind of a thing, and it's been helpful in regard. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you. I know that a lot of people get really annoyed by chaff in their coffee, so you're definitely not alone, Pete. Okay, so our last pre-submitted question, and then I'm going to try to get to as many of those typed in questions as I can, has to do with the Gene Cafe and asking about how you can apply those stretch in the roast articles that I talked about a little bit earlier to a Gene Cafe. So the Gene Cafe, I think, is a really awesome roaster. It's kind of cool because it's a combination of like an air roaster and a drum roaster. So you have a slightly longer roast time, you have a bigger batch size, you can get a little bit more body and development a little bit more easily than you can in a typical air roaster. But because it kind of works by pushing hot air into that rotating chamber, you also get a little bit more of that brightness and acidity that you expect from an air roaster, which is something that I really like in my coffee personally. I know that's not for everybody. The other thing I really like about the Gene Cafe is that it's really simple and really intuitive to use. I would say it's one of the easiest roasters we have to just get roasting with straight out of the box because the controls are so simple. You can only control time and temperature. Unfortunately, because of that, it's super easy to use and get a really good roast. It can be a little bit trickier to mess around with profiling and that kind of thing just because you have a little bit less control compared to some of the other roasters where you have much more control over like airflow, which is an easy way to profile, or where temperature changes are a little bit more responsive. Generally, my recommendation for the Gene Calf is to start on the highest temperature. Definitely, I like preheating as well. It's going to take a while to get up there. You can get a little bit of development, and then maybe if you want to stretch it out a little bit, you can pull back on that energy, maybe like right before you're about to hit first crack, and that will kind of slow it down without stopping it and letting it bake because there's a little bit of a delay. But again, with the Gene Calf, unfortunately, you're gonna have to like really play around with it, see how your particular machine works, and experiment with when to turn up your temperature and when to turn it down to kind of get the results that you want. Something that's really helpful if you're trying to do this is make sure you're using a roast log, or at least kind of writing down like the different temperatures you see like every minute or so, and make sure you're marking when you're hitting first crack, when you're leaving first crack, those kinds of things, because you'll be able to more concretely see the effect of your setting changes on the Gene Cafe rather than just relying on what you're seeing on the temperature readout, because it is pretty simplistic. Okay, let's see. Okay, so that's it for our pre-canned questions. I realize we've only got about 5 minutes left in the AMA, so I'm going to try to look through and see if I can answer the last few questions. Let's see, the Gene Cafe. Okay, so Gary is asking about the book R1 from Aleo. He says there seems to be way too much focus on the Scott Rao declining ROR, and he can end up with a great curve and end up with so-so roast. I actually think this is the perfect question to end on, because that's definitely something that I've noticed as a person who didn't start out using roasting software or having anything like Artisan or Roast Timer, those kinds of programs to kind of do some of the data logging for me. Really started out relying on sense, time, smell cues, listening for the cracks, those kinds of things, to kind of see where my coffee is, and then tasting it and seeing how it goes. I definitely think that Scott Rao knows a crazy amount about roasting, way more than I do, and I think he's a really great resource, but I'm a little wary of accepting any kind of strict dogma of what a good roast looks like, what it should be. Definitely there are things where if something really turning out quite right and you can't quite tell, going back and looking at your curve can be a really good way of kind of diagnosing what might have gone wrong or something like that. But if you're only looking at your software, if you're only looking at your curve and you're not paying attention to the other changes you're seeing in the coffee or other things like that, chances are you might not be getting everything you want out of your coffee or everything out of the roast that it could be getting. If you have a coffee that tastes great to you and doesn't have a perfect curve, who really cares about the curve? I don't think there's any like right way or wrong way. And again, at Sweet Maria is one of the things that we really like about home roasting and kind of giving people all these resources is we can make recommendations, we can give people advice, but really you're in the driver's seat, and whatever tastes good to you, looks good to you, is what you want. Like that's why you're roasting. It's for yourself. It's for what you want to do, and who really cares if your curve doesn't look exactly perfect or isn't like the star of the forum. So that's what I would say to you, Gary. Okay, so it looks like we're coming up on 1:45, so that is it for today's live stream. We're going to be trying to do more focused live streams moving forward. Again, maybe some that are focused specifically on home roasting, maybe some that are focused specifically on home brewing, or on like farming and cultivation questions. So if you do have any of those questions, please continue to submit those to Byron. You can email them to him at byron@sweetmarias.com, and that way we can make sure to address it at future streams. Otherwise, if you are having a specific issue or if you want us to kind of answer your questions a little sooner rather than later, go ahead, send us an email to info@sweetmarias.com and we will get back to you within like 1 to 2 days max. Always here, always ready to help you, and hope everyone is staying safe and healthy out there. Have a good day, guys.